Well, my name is Willy Kotiuga. I live in Montreal, Canada, and I've worked in over 40 countries, and corruption is something that uh, I have seen from many countries. And what I'd like to do is basically walk you through an example of what I have experienced, and that'll take about 10, 11 minutes. And then we'll have about 18 minutes for discussion. So I'm still getting used to doing things without a technical support, but that's okay. So basically, I'll start with a story of what happened to me, and then we'll go into some examples. On March 22nd, 2013, the World Bank debarred one of the largest consulting firms for unethical practices. The company had to find the guilty parties and prove their complicity in the events that led to the disbarment. The face-to-face inquisition started shortly after that. As a senior director for one of the divisions, I became a prime target of the investigations. Everything seemed to happen at the last minute with the inquisitors. I never knew ahead of time what to expect. I usually only received a couple of days' notice to appear at a conference room for a meeting, and each invitation was a warning that as an employee, I had to fully cooperate and not tell anyone anything about my meeting. All the discussions had to remain confidential. At first, I found the meetings with the inquisitors interesting. However, after the first few meetings, I started getting physically sick at the thought of them. The tone during the sessions changed over time, and I felt they were determined to prove my guilt. I never knew the subject of the meetings before entering the room. They asked me probing questions, carefully noting my responses, and with each question trying to get me to stumble on my recollections. When there was nothing more to say about a subject, they would pull out copies of emails I had long ago deleted and ask me to read them. One senior inquisitor was surprised when everything I said verbally aligned perfectly with the contents of the email. You should have seen his face. There was never a discrepancy between my recollections and the emails they extracted from the archives. Maybe it was a strategy to wear me down. Well, their strategy was working. With each session, their assumption I was guilty affected me to the point I was taking sick days to get back to normal. At the corporate level, the company promoted well-being and health, yet I felt they were undermining my health. The bullying was fully sanctioned at the highest level. The CEO gave explicit instructions to find and punish the guilty. And they kept on quoting extracts from the official ethics guide. When I finally reread the ethics policy, I discovered they had violated at least 3 significant principles: assumption of guilt, bullying, and fairness. On the first point, the guide states that there should be no assumption of guilt. The inquisitors repeatedly assumed I was guilty. On the second point, bullying would never be tolerated within the company, yet they kept on pressuring me to incriminate myself when I was not guilty. On the third point, fair treatment for everyone, I was not treated fairly. After 21 meetings over 18 months, I finally had enough. I could take no more of this harassment. I wrote directly to the head of compliance, complaining of their treatment of me. Silence. I received no reply. Finally, I accused the company of violating its own ethics policy. This time, copying carefully selected people within the company. Although the chief of compliance still refused to meet with me, he sent his senior inquisitors. They were much more conciliatory. Maybe it was because I controlled the agenda this time. but it was the 22nd and last meeting I ever had with them. They never contacted me again. I decided at that point to use up my accumulated vacation days, and I resigned when they ran out on November 1st, 2018. While I had enough information to build a solid case against the company, I chose not to. I wanted to enjoy my retirement and not waste any more time being miserable with unfair accusatory bullies. Until the Inquisition started, my career was better than I ever could have imagined. And I chose to leave quietly on a lasting memory of all the positive experience. After all, over the 35 years with the company, the good ones were the ones that shaped me most. This is, just a moment. This is what happens on the receiving end. There are perpetrators and there are victims, and they're not always the same. In the Bible, we have many examples of integrity. In the Old Testament, Ruth and Daniel are shining examples how integrity changes the landscape of nations. We often forget, though, at what personal cost it took to bring hope. At the start of the Common Era, God used both Mary and Stephen to show us how we should live in a world where politics was beyond their immediate control. In the last century, Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela showed us a different way and the power of living by principles of integrity. Over the last 40 years, I have lived and worked in 25 countries. I've advised governments, corporations, the World Bank. I've come face to face with both perpetrators and victims at all levels. While everyone talked about integrity and ethical business practices, many worked under the table and out of plain sight. I observed that many of the business practices, many of the leaders who spoke loudest against corruption were often significant perpetrators in undermining the principles of God. We need to look at a new ecosystem. So often, we can put the best rules and regulations in place, but nothing will change until there's a change of heart. We only need to look at Philippians and how at the end of the book of Philippians, how God has to be front and center if we're going to find peace. So how do we change the prevailing state of business hearts to thrive on integrity? I always had a consistent message to all of my clients. If you want to make deals under the table, you are speaking to the wrong person. So what happens is that over the last 20 years or so, companies have started setting the tone for anti-corruption. And so often we as anti-corruption crusaders forget that God is on our side. And we try to fight our battles on our own. And we lose unless we have God walking alongside us. But you know, God has not been idle in turning the tide to restore integrity. Over the last 20 years, most significant corporations developed ethics guidelines and programs. And what you, and just a moment. And what you see in front of you is an extract of one of the company programs. But the beauty of it is if you read it carefully, it's actually the Bible. The essential elements of Scripture are there. You will see references to accountability, fairness, integrity, anti-corruption, a focus on well-being. The standards are out in the open, and most companies require that you go for training each year. So God has already set the framework that we can build upon. So what is the pathway to change? Well, the first thing is to work alongside what God is doing. Do we recognize the roots of corruption? Do we know and understand the nature of corruption? With what we know, we need to discern and hear what God expects us to do. But the most important part is, how do we fit into God's plan to walk alongside him in his mission? It should never be trying to get God to agree to our plan. His presence and leadership are essential in each step of the way. One of the things is we need to only look at Scripture. And what we have here is the written prophets. And the written prophets, they have been speaking out against corruption since 850 BC, starting with Obadiah. One of the things about all the written prophets, their relationship with God was driven by their personal covenant with God, not motivated by expectation of getting something in return for their efforts. And if you distill each one of the messages of the written prophets into one word, this is what you get. Obadiah talked about restructuring, Jonah about authority, Hosea a message of compassion, Daniel about integrity, Zechariah about sustainability. But what's interesting about all these words, the foremost management consultants training business leaders use the exact same words. But what they don't have is they don't have a covenant relationship with God. It may be music to management's ears, but often their hearts remain as hard as Pharaoh's. Management gurus charge high fees to say the exact words that the prophets used, but they don't have sustainable results. So one of the questions that I ask, are you politically correct or prophetically disruptive? None of these prophets were politically correct. Each one was prophetically disruptive. Being politically correct means that you're accountable to a system that is governed by transactions without upsetting the status quo. The role of the prophet was to bring people back to God by upsetting the status quo. The reality is that we are not prepared to lead. We should at least be prepared to be led where we may not want to go. We are called to promote integrity in business world by being prophetically disruptive. Prophetic disruptiveness restores a covenant relationship with God, which is fully accountable to God. God is calling us to build on the foundations laid by the prophets and to turn their hearts to God. And in closing, I would like to say is that we celebrated Earth Day on April 22nd. As Christians, we missed the opportunity to lead the world, to fulfill humankind's responsibility to care for and tend the earth. We let others lead. And what did they do? They reduced environmental management to a system based on targets and carbon taxes, essentially transactions. But here, God has already laid the groundwork. Let's not miss the opportunity to walk with God, to lead the way to integrity that restores the covenantal relationship God always intended us to have with him. We must let God teach us how to become politically disruptive. With that, my story and a few points that I made, I'm open up to questions. If you have something to add, please unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment.
Hi, Willy.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, David.
Thank you for sharing this important subject. I really feel with you because I'm also a businessman and very much involved in the church at the same time. And there is an issue to do with trusting employees, you know, and giving authority to take charge of certain decision making. But we faced a challenge with people cheating and creating separate accounting system on Excel and dealing with customers saying, if you take this cash from us, we don't report to the tax authority. Anyways, all temptation, giving price lower than the cost. But anyway, when it reached the court, it appeared that the evidence collected against people who corrupt in the company, it's an awesome task because you are trusting the people, then they are doing all these things in a very devious way. And you end up fighting in the court, you become like you are the victim and you have to prove everything. And it becomes really frustrating. It takes a long time. I'm speaking, by the way, from Jordan. And I have business in the States. I did business in the States and in Jordan. This probably happened with our company here in Jordan. But being a man of faith, works in the church, and I lead, the council. I'm the vice chair of the Jordan Evangelical Council. I found it very, to a point, sorry to say that, embarrassing for me to go to the court and try to defend myself, even though I am raising the case. So I think corruption, to prevent it, we must take really check and verify approach all the time. You have to be guard all the time. And very sad, even if you put people you trust to take care of certain jobs. In many cases, people choose to do their work by themselves, and this way the company never grows. So it's a toss between how much system you should implement to prevent corruption, and if you can give courses to your employees guided by the teachings of the scripture, which is, we find it here extremely difficult to mix business with that. Is this a way of the believer, or should you use certain that you really can trust, but at the same time check on them at every task and every day? I want to hear your experience, since you've been in and you have faced it all. Thank you.
Well, one of the things that I incorporated in all my presentations to clients, whether it was the World Bank to governors, and that is I had an ethics moment and a safety moment. Being from an engineering firm, you always have a safety moment. And I used that safety moment to highlight a scriptural principle that we are responsible, that we have to work together, because safety is an issue of, it's everybody's responsibility. But then what I started doing is I started adding on an ethics moment in all my presentations. And in fact, that's now the company I used to work for is 40,000 people. They all have ethics moments. And so a lot of those ethics moments are based on scripture. So maybe not using the Bible directly, which I didn't do in Saudi Arabia, but I did give ethics moments. And we need to come back to scripture and let people know what our values are and what the core of them is. Next person, I don't know who it was. Just unmute yourself and speak.
Thank you, Brother Willy, for the good sharing. I'm John Dash from Bangladesh. I want to share some event or incident. That is the purchasing issue. The Authority of Purchasing Committee, they don't take any from the vendor, but when vendor invited the authority person for the dinner party, the purchasing authority accept the invitations. So what do you think it is corruption or any integrity issues?
Well, you know, this is the hard part of fighting corruption. There's different standards in different companies. Like, for example, in France 20 years ago, the money that you spent for corruption, for bribing people, was tax deductible. Now, that has changed. And so sometimes, depending on the situation, I've been invited to many dinners, but I've turned it around and I've talked about values. And sometimes it's an open door to let people know what are your values. And I remember someone came to me, I hadn't worked with them for 20 years, somewhere in Africa, and he wanted a favor from me. But he remembered me from 20 years earlier when I taught him things, when I laid out some principles. And he was about to ask me a question, and then he stopped and he says, I know you. I don't need to ask. And he didn't. So, you know, your reputation of integrity, it sends a message, even though we think nothing has happened.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions?
Yeah, Bixon here.
Yes, Vixen.
Yeah, this is Bixon Bulanda from Zambia. Yeah, I'm actually very touched with the way you've brought the scriptures to be able to actually help us learn how we can do in the business world. Now, my question is, why is it that Christians are the ones, some Christians are the ones who are in forefront promoting corruption? Why is it so? I'm speaking actually from my context, African context.
Well, we have 30 seconds before we're brought back to the main session. One of the things is, feel free to, you will get a copy of this presentation.
Okay.
And also feel free to email me.
All right.
But as Christians, God has, what my message is, God has laid the foundations through scripture.
Mm-hmm.
He has laid the foundations through ethics